On average, 250,000 immigrants arrive every year to Canada, and approximately 70% have a first language other than English or French. Amongst the First Nations and early Western European migrants, Canada has welcomed immigrants from throughout the world, from all continents, and arriving in all fathomable circumstances, from landed immigrants, students, and reunification of families to refugees escaping war, famine, and persecution. Canada has endured as a symbol of hope and safety throughout the world. As such, Hanan, Arif, and I, Navraj, have focused our group inquiry project on newly arriving immigrants to Canada of non-English speaking backgrounds and their study of English in formal and informal settings in British Columbia. The Immigrant Services Society of BC is an immigrant support service that began in 1972. It has offices throughout the Lower Mainland as well as Prince George. It provides services for first language settlement support, community connections, immigrant women, multicultural youth, seniors, children, and settlement orientation services. Their mission statement is helping immigrants build a future in Canada. Their core values reflect dignity, mutual respect, and creating a welcoming hospital environment for immigrants. Language Instruction for Newcomers to Canada, or LINC, is the English language instruction program administered by ISS of BC. Classrooms also incorporate an introduction to Canadian culture. Later classes focus on life and work and further specialization for Canadian employment. There's also a formal ISS Language and Career College of BC for formal training in English for permanent residents and Canadian citizens. LINC, however, focuses on recent arrivals and is free for permanent residents. Instruction is classroom-based and fosters a welcoming and non-threatening environment. At ISS of BC, learning transpires through a focus on technology, touchscreens, computers, and language software. ISS of BC also has their own unique website providing access to online learning called Janice's ESL website. There's a program called Learning in Action. Participants practice speaking English with a volunteer, and blended online learning for later classes. A specific focus is applied to learning workplace English, as well as knowledge and understanding of practical topics, including the Canadian job market and workplace culture. Confidence is gained in expressing oneself and interacting with others. Further training in job search and soft skills for employment success, as well as digital skills for the Canadian workplace. All of this is accomplished through a flexible schedule of in-class and online sessions.
After discussing our context and setting, we need to understand the nature of second language acquisition in adults and how different it is from children. And this is very important for educators and learners themselves to understand what factors could affect their second language acquisition. There are internal and external factors that could affect their acquisition. We will discuss both of them. We'll start first with the internal factors. So one of the differences between adults SLA and children SLA is that adult second language acquisition occur after cognitive development is basically complete, unlike children who are learning while still developing. And also there is the critical period hypothesis that suggests that language learning is maturationally limited and that automatic acquisition from just being exposed to a language seems to disappear after puberty, and therefore foreign language have to be taught and learned through conscious and labored effort. And it's believed that beyond this period, native-like proficiency or success is almost impossible, especially in terms of phonetic sounds or phonetic production. There has been a lot of debate around this hypothesis, but many researchers seem to agree that it's true. Also, the sex of the learner can affect their language acquisition. Female learners tend to outperform their male counterparts. This can also be explained in the from a neurological aspect that I will discuss in the next slide. But there is not a lot of research about this topic, but recent research shows that females tend to achieve or to achieve higher in second language compared to males, especially in terms of phonology acquisition, and also females tend to be more motivated and have positive attitudes toward second language learning. Also, prior linguistic experience can affect the second language acquisition or third language in this case. So, acquiring an additional language is usually easier for multilinguals than monolinguals. So, just like computer programmers or chess players, experienced bilingual language learners appears to be or to have an advantage when compared to beginner monolingual learners. So, if you were bilingual when you were young and you were using these two languages, it becomes easier for you to learn a third language when you become an adult. However, if you've been a monolingual for your entire life and then had to learn a foreign language when you became an adult, it will be a lot harder for you. And I think this is very important for educators to consider, in addition to other factors, of course, when dealing with immigrant ESL or in any ESL context. So, the neurocognitive processes are not completely well understood in second language acquisition, but researchers try to look at it from two types of memory systems and try to explain the acquisition from that perspective. So there are two types of memory systems, the declarative and procedural. The declarative memory system includes the learning, representation, and use of knowledge about facts, so semantic knowledge and events. The knowledge learned in the declarative memory is at least partly explicit and is available to conscious awareness. It underlies the mental lexicon and stores lexical knowledge. On the other hand, the procedural memory system includes the learning of new and in control of long established motor and cognitive skills and habits, especially those involving sequences. So neither the learning nor the remembering of these procedures appears to be accessible to conscious memory. So it's often referred to as an implicit memory system. And it supports the learning of grammar. The two systems interact both cooperatively and competitively in the acquisition and use of language. And actually, increased functionality in one system may depress the other, and vice versa. The declarative procedural model suggests that in the late acquisition of second or subsequent languages, learning grammar and procedural memory is more problematic than learning lexical or other linguistic knowledge in declarative memory. Therefore, adult second language learners rely particularly heavily on declarative memory, depending on this system not only for storing lexical knowledge, but also for memorizing complex forms and rules of grammar. And this type of memory is not suited for this type of information, the grammatical information. However, with sufficient experience with the language, the procedural system should be able to acquire some or most of the grammatical knowledge for second language learners. Also, due to increased levels of estrogen, female learners have an advantage in the declarative memory system, which research shows that is affected by estrogen. There are also external factors that can affect adult second language acquisition. The interaction hypothesis proposed by Long suggests that second language development is facilitated when learners interact with other speakers. The major components of this hypothesis are input, feedback, and output. Krashen proposed that L2 learners require something called comprehensible input. Krashen said that when learners understand language that is one level plus of their level, so the language that is slightly more advanced than their current level of competence, acquisition will occur. Feedback is also important. Feedback refers to information that learners receive in response to their communicative efforts. This feedback may be explicit, as in direct corrections, or implicit. Researchers and teachers have long believed that feedback is an important element in the process of learning in L2. Output is generally understood to be the language that the learners produces. There is two types of outputs: comprehensible output, which is the utterances that are understandable in the interaction, and the other type is modified output, which is the utterances that have been modified in response to an interlocutor's signal of not understanding. So modified output promotes learners' automatization, pushes learners to notice gaps in their L2 knowledge, encourages them to process syntactically rather than semantically, and also provide them with opportunities to test their language. Yes, and of course there are many factors that can affect the output. The last factor that we are going to discuss from the external factors is the explicitness in pedagogical intervention. While children acquire one, two, or even more languages through mere exposure to them, SLA research shows that L2 competence of adult learners seems to benefit from metalinguistic information, which is from being, or that is from being given information regarding how the language works. So exposure to explicit instruction seems to speed up the process of the language acquisition. So explicitness is important in second language acquisition. Of course, there are many factors that could affect their or many external factors that could affect their acquisition. However, we do not have the time to discuss all of them. So these are just some or like major factors that can affect the acquisition.
Okay, moving on from the description of the place, the people, how second language acquisition transpires or is inhibited in adults, we now come to the theoretical perspectives that we use to approach learning in this place. Remember, this is the language classroom, language instruction for newcomers to Canada. Okay, we used Bood 1989's 4 traditions of learning in adult education to analyze learning in this place. The 4 traditions are training in efficiency, andragogy, humanism, and critical pedagogy. Something in common for all these traditions that they have this idea as the goal being learner autonomy and empowerment. Training in efficiency falls under the larger idea or larger learning theory of behaviorism, where the learner needs to demonstrate observable changes to show that they've understood the concept. Within this model of learning and training in efficiency, you have lots of technical schools, lots of vocational schools, but remember we are at in a language classroom. But this is a language classroom specifically for new immigrants to Canada. In this case, we have this idea of the undifferentiated self, which means that despite being multiple individuals, and yes, everyone has different names and nationalities, They're just abstract entities. They're statistics. They're not really considered for each of their individual knowledge and experience. They're all just grouped together as one, newcomers to Canada in the same classroom, and they're given a set curriculum, a path that they have to follow, and they're taught that this is Canadian society, this is what you have to learn, this is what's right in Canada. So it's this idea of induction into givens comes from Usher, which is this idea that it's about giving over your autonomy into this adaptation into this new place, which we'll get to on the next slide. Okay, to continue our discussion of the language classroom at ISS of BC, we're going to use the framework of experiential learning. And this is from Usher 2009. The quote on the left is, "Experience in adult education discourse has mainly signified freedom from regulation in the service of personal autonomy and or social empowerment." So the goal of adult education, we started with this earlier, is this idea of personal autonomy and social empowerment. So we're going to use this framework of experiential learning to talk about criticisms of Link, how learning is taking place there, and how we think learning should be there. But first of all, let's take a look at this chart. This is figure 5.1. This is on page 104 of the same Usher article. Over here, he presents a schema or a map of experiential learning, and he describes 4 quadrants where learning takes place. For this presentation, we're just going to focus on the vocational quadrant where Link falls under. And let me give you this quote. Vocational practices for Usher is the application of learning in the service of adaptation to the existing techno-social order. So in this case, the application of learning is the job skills, what the learners are required to do to become able to get a job in Canada. And the adaptation is to this society. They have to follow the path that is provided to them by ISS of BC, that they are told this is how Canadians are like, and this is the path you must follow. So they have to actually give up their personal autonomy and adapt to this society, and they apply themselves to get jobs. Okay, moving on to the next slide to go over some criticisms of the Link classroom. I'm going to use a quote from Usher here. The tradition of training and efficiency in learning depends on a body of predefined knowledge or skills, couched in terms of objectives, which are often behavioral in nature, and learned in a planned and efficient way. Pedagogy becomes a technical matter, with the learner receiving pre-planned inputs and producing or enacting predefined outputs. Learning becomes a neutral process. I think this connects really well with the Link classroom, because the students have to produce their predefined output. There's a path they have to follow. The teachers use these pre-planned inputs. They grade learners on a scale of from the Canadian language benchmarks, which is a task-based curriculum, which divides skills into speaking, listening, reading, writing. And they just keep following the curriculum, and when the learner reaches that level, they just keep going up into the next level. As Usher says here, learning becomes a neutral process, which we're going to criticize in the next page here. But this idea over here is that you're just maintaining the status quo. There's a path that they're following, and no change is occurring. And another criticism from Fleming 2007 is that it's not long enough. The classes don't give the adult learners enough time to develop this Canadian identity, and it's just limited to job preparation. Okay, we've come to the final part of our presentation now, where we're going to be talking about how learning should be happening in these classrooms. We've already explained a little bit about the training and efficiency, tradition, authentic learning, specifically functional practices. But we'd like to talk about a few of the other traditions here. We're going to start with andragogy. So just step back a second. Experiential learning as a framework allows us to challenge the dominance of higher education. And one of the big things that trouble immigrants is this idea of accreditation and transferring qualifications. But if we can build on the prior knowledge that the people coming to Canada have and build from that prior knowledge and provide specific educational learning needs to help people build on specific skills that instead of a one size fits all situation. This could be by incorporating more self-directed learning into the classroom. So that would be more andragogy. If you look at the chart 3.1 from Knowles et al. 2015, you can see there's a huge part of this shaded area where it says pedagogy practiced inappropriately, andragogy would be more appropriate. Or would be appropriate. I think the Ling classes fall not completely, but definitely part of the Ling classes fall under this point where there's just too pedagogic, and we need to give learners more independence and allow them more options, and maybe not follow these set established paths. Allow people more student directed and self directed elements that allow them to find their own paths. Moving on, we also have this idea of humanism, mainly from Carl Rogers, who said learning is not about the subject matter. So in this case, it's not about learning the language, but it's about finding your true, authentic self. And he viewed society as a negative force that actually manipulates and distorts autonomy. So for him, the classes could even be blocking the learner's full potential. So we have to use learning more to find ourselves and find what's true to us. And this is also another way that the Link class could improve, I guess, again. And one more idea here is critical pedagogy. This is about being more aware of the oppressive social structures in society, and also knowing that, as in the previous slide, that learning is not a neutral process. Learning is definitely a political process. It's been established by powers that were, and it continues to be. We need to include into the learning a discussion of privilege, include concepts of the glass ceiling, include discussions of difficulties for people applying for jobs with different ethnic backgrounds or strong accents. There need to be more awareness of what's happening in the current Canadian society. Okay, moving into our conclusion here, I have to start by just providing a critique of the framework that we're using, experiential learning. All the learning traditions that we covered view sociality as something negative. For example, in critical pedagogy, we have these oppressive social forces. In the training and efficiency model, you have distractions that prevent you from achieving. In humanism, it's about finding your true, authentic self and staying away from the manipulating social relations. And in andragogy, it's about self-directed self, so that you find your own needs, about taking care of your own needs. So the big criticism for all of these is that it's individual. It's with experiential learning, you think about the individual having an encounter, an event, They're reflecting on that event, and then an experience takes shape in your head, and you can learn from that experience. Um, so the learning traditions that we talked about, they focus on this individual and volunteerism. By volunteerism, I mean that there are, for example, in training and efficiency, there are predefined, predetermined paths. At the same time, it's your choice whether you want to go through that process or not. Similar with humanism and finding your authentic self, and in andragogy with self-directed learning, it's about looking into yourself and seeing what you want to learn and finding and going through it at your own pace, at your own will. Whereas this fourth tradition, critical pedagogy, while society or while sociality is still viewed as negative because of these oppressive social forces, um, the idea in this learning tradition is now we are trying to create, instead of individual empowerment, it's about social empowerment. And instead of you having the choice, you have to work towards creating awareness of privilege in society and the oppressive forces that dominate and create this power imbalance in society. So it's not like an optional path. It's you have to work this way. It's about social empowerment, and there's a path that you have to follow. But moving towards where we want to go, where we think this class should be, is more in the model of community of practice. So more towards the social cultural understanding of learning, where it's not just formal learning instruction. It's about creating communities and groups that work together to achieve.